Hello friends, today I'll start building a park bench, garden bench type of thing. It's a job for an artist and will be part of an art installation, but people are meant to sit on it, so it's not just a prop, it needs to be a sturdy, functional, normal bench. I've got a fairly tight deadline of 6 days, so I've bought dimensioned lumber, 2x4s to be precise, which suits the chunky aesthetic that the artist is going for. No time to waste, so let's have a look at the drawing and then we'll get started. So here's the design drawn in conversation with the artist. As you can see, it's rather chunky and simple, but with a few angles that will make it a bit more fun than just screwing 2x4s together. It's also designed to come apart for transport, so it will be built as 4 modules: the seat, the backrest, and the 2 leg assemblies. I selected my boards for the seat and backrest and placed them face down on the bench to mark where I will attach some blocks on the underside. This will be done with what is basically half-lap joints, but much more shallow. It would be strong enough to just glue them on without joinery, but doing, let's call it, quarter laps will give registration in the glue up, so everything ends up square and probably a bit stronger against racking forces as well. I sawed these lines with my old carcass saw because I actually built this bench before I made the new saw. I roughly chopped out most of the waste and then cleaned up all the joints to depth with a router plane. Next, I measured out the blocks that will have the other half of the joint, making sure to cut around big knots where possible. To clean up these surfaces where the router plane can't rest on something on both sides, I have a Japanese plane with a skewed blade that lets it cut into a corner and makes it very pleasant to use across the grain. Less pleasant, but still important, is to pre-drill some pilot holes through this, because I will use screws for pressure on the glue so I don't have to leave these in clamps overnight. To get a really snug fit on these joints and have everything square itself up in assembly, I made them a bit too tight and then just took a few shavings of the side of the blocks until they seated with no wiggle room. One downside to working with construction lumber is the big roundovers that give it a very recognizable look, but a couple of swipes with the scrub plane turns that into a large chamfer instead, and in my opinion quite effectively transforms the board into something with a much more intentional look. To finish off the ends, they get chamfered too with a block plane. And then I could glue this together into the first 2 sections, the seat and backrest, which are built in the same way. The joints were planed flush and square, making sure not to blow out the edges of the end grain, and the chamfers were added to the blocks as well. Next up, I laid out and labeled my parts for the leg sections, and cross-cutting these long boards is most conveniently done off the end of my bench. I flattened a reference face and squared one edge. That is all planing I need at the moment. I could then knife my joinery lines, which in this case is mostly angled, to get the splayed legs and leaning backrest. A pencil line marks the length of this soon-to-be bridle joint, and I also drew the taper I plan to cut into the leg later as a visual reminder of what part of this is and how it's oriented. Since this part is a leg, I'm taking off the outsides of the joint, leaving a tenon, so I'll have 2/3 of the horizontal part resting on the vertical grain on the leg, if that makes sense. If not, you'll see what I mean soon. I marked the size of the tenon onto the horizontal part that will bear the bench seat and transferred this to the other side using the same angle as on the shoulder of the tenon. After scribing the width with the mortise gauge, I then removed the middle third, creating the bridle joint. This then is the other end of the horizontal piece, where I first have to cut them to length at an angle again. Here they will get a tenon to go into the mortise in the back leg. This shoulder is at a slightly different angle to allow the full width of the piece to rest on a sort of shelf in the leg, so the full weight of people is not held by the tenon alone. Again, this will be more clear soon. These two are the back legs, and I used a front leg to mark the height where the horizontal piece should land. This is where that little shelf is made, and I brought in the horizontal to mark the height of the mortise and how deep the shelf should be. Then I could connect those dots, and that's the chunk I have to remove before I can make the actual mortise. This face is where the shoulder of the tenon is going to seat, so I took some time to make sure it was flat and square. The shape of the tenon was drawn on the leg as a visual guide, and the width scribed onto the face to receive the mortise. With the mortises and tenons done, I could saw and plane the front legs to shape and start assembling. The back legs still need one more joint though, and this will be a simple half lap but at a wonky angle to make the backrest lean a bit. After the glue dried, I drew the tapers. On the backrest support it actually changes angle about halfway. This was a mid-build decision to make the backrest a little less inclined than originally planned. Since there was this change in angle, I couldn't plane these surfaces. Instead I clamped a piece side by side with the backrest support and flattened it with a chisel. Below the mortise on the leg, the taper could be planed smooth. And then it was time for the final glue up, joining the back legs to the horizontal parts. Because of the angle behind the mortise, I'll have to use a small block with a corresponding angle as a clamping caul. While that dried, I quickly cleaned off the machine marks from the seat and backrest. I then applied a spot of primer to any knots in the boards to prepare them for filler. The leg assemblies were planed a little too, once dry, to flush everything up. Excess at the bridle joint in the front leg was sawn off, smoothed and chamfered. Another way to seal the joints is to use shellac, which is cheaper than primer paint and works just as well. To cut the legs to length, I measured along the blade of my large square and connected the marks on the front and back leg to get the proper angle as well. Here you have an easy way to make the bench more comfortable by angling this line slightly to make the front leg a little taller than the rear, which would incline the entire bench backwards, but this time the task was to make it completely horizontal. Finally, I could assemble the seat, legs and backrest, and this is done with screws so it can come apart for transport. Having the leg assemblies screwed into both the horizontal and the near vertical blocks makes the bench extremely rigid. I then took it apart again to give it a coat of primer paint. The artist will do the rest of the painting to make it blend in with the other elements of her installation. And here is the installation as it looked in the gallery during exhibition. The idea was that the viewer could sit down on the bench and read a comic book about the character sitting next to them, while surrounded by an environment that looks like it came out of the comic. Really fun job with some interesting angle joinery, and it was cool to have a piece in an art gallery, even though the bench itself, of course, is not the focus of the artwork. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you later. Bye.